So you want to join the Fujifilm X system, but aren't quite sure yet what camera you should get. It can be quite confusing, especially when you first get into photography, or maybe you're switching over to the Fujifilm X system from another brand, but you're still not sure which camera would suit you best. Well, I'll go through some of their product range, so you can find out what camera would be best for a beginner, as well as which one would be best suited for your style. But first I want to get into why the Fujifilm X system is as popular as it is. I think there are three big reasons for it, each one as important as the other. Firstly, because they focus on the X system, which is an APS-C system. A lot of other camera manufacturers also have an APS-C system, which is a cropped sensor, smaller than a full frame, but usually they just have them to incentivize people to buy into their full frame system. Fujifilm doesn't do that, they don't have a full frame system, so they can fully concentrate on that APS-C system. Though Fujifilm doesn't only have the APS-C system, they also have a medium format system, which is the GFX system, but I think these two camera lines are very distant from one another. That way they have built a reputation of delivering good and reliable products in a compact size for a decent price. And that's exactly why they are so popular. People don't necessarily want big cameras with chunky glass in front of them. They enjoy having small, compact, interchangeable lens cameras with the lenses to match it. Secondly, the reason that even people that don't necessarily know much about Fujifilm still kind of know, which is Fujifilm's beautiful color science, which even has like a little fan group inside of Fujifilm shooters. Of course, just like with other camera brands, you have pre-selected color grades within your camera to choose from. Fujifilm calls those film simulations. That's because they try to imitate old film stock. For example, they have Velvia, which is a very vibrant option for your pictures, great for landscape photography. One of my favorites, Classic Negative, they describe it as having enhanced colors with hard tonality. Basically very vibrant pictures with very bright but soft looking highlights and very dark shadows. But also a black and white film stock like Acros, which is just like a normal black and white film stock but with richer details and increased sharpness. But then there's this own subset of people within the Fujifilm X system that create their own JPEG film stocks, which Fujifilm cameras allow you to create. They recreate all kinds of old film stocks and share them with other people to use as well. There's even this cool app where a lot of people share these film stocks, which is called Fuji X Weekly. And the third reason, my personal favorite, the film-like shooting experience when using Fujifilm cameras. Because most of their cameras have physical dials for shutter speed and ISO on top of the camera, as well as aperture rings on the lenses. This way you can adjust your settings without looking at the screen of your camera, but at the camera itself. It, in my opinion, makes you pay more attention to the settings you are using, and that way intuitively makes you know what kind of aperture, shutter speed and ISO you need for a certain composition. In addition, it slows me down when I'm shooting a certain composition, which sounds like a bad thing when you first hear it. But on second thought, this slowing down makes you pay more attention to all the subjects you want in or out of your frame, making for better images after all. Fujifilm has a whole lot of different cameras, but most noticeably they have three different types of cameras. Firstly, the SLR style camera like the XT line, the rangefinder style camera, for example the X Pro line, as well as the PSM dial cameras like the XH line. Earlier I mentioned these three different features that makes Fujifilm stand out from all the other camera manufacturers. The SLR style and the rangefinder style camera have all three of them, while the PSM dial cameras obviously miss the third reason, which is the film-like shooting experience, because they don't have these physical dials on top of the camera to change your shutter speed and your ISO. So this is the first thing you have to think about when choosing your first Fujifilm X camera. Which of these three camera types will suit your shooting experience the best? Now let's start with something easy. Do you need weather resistance? That's a pretty easy answer if you've already owned a camera before, because you can just look at all the shots you took before, and if you took a good chunk of them in the rain, you probably need a camera that can withstand this weather. But if you rarely ever do any photography in the elements, it's kind of useless to spend this extra money for a high-tier camera just so you have weather resistance that you don't really use. Especially because if you have a camera that doesn't have weather resistance and you're out and it starts raining, you can usually just put the camera in some waterproof sling bag or so. With Fujifilm cameras, it's usually structured that way that the higher tier models get the weather resistance and the middle or lower tier models do not. So if you want this feature, you'll have to grab deep in your pocket to buy it. So for example, the X-T5 for the SLR style cameras and the XH2 for the PSM dial cameras have weather resistance, but are also more expensive. And and especially for a beginner, maybe don't make that much sense. Another question you should think about: do you need a new camera or will a second-hand camera suffice? I personally chose a new camera when I entered the Fujifilm X system, but in retrospect, a second-hand camera would have probably been the better choice, certainly the cheaper choice. Because if you buy that second-hand camera, you can usually buy a higher tier model with more features in comparison to a camera that you would buy new, a lower or mid-tier model. A good example would be buying the Fujifilm X-T3, which is an older generation but very feature-packed camera of the basically higher tier of cameras from Fujifilm, which would set you back about 900 euros in an excellent condition. The same amount of money, 900 euros, would buy you, for example, a Fujifilm X-T30 Mark II, which is a new camera, but it is not as feature-packed as the X-T3. So you really have to decide for yourself if it's worth it for you to buy a new camera that is less feature-packed, or if it is more worth it to buy a second-hand camera that is more feature-packed. And then another question you have to ask yourself: do you want a modern PASM dial camera, or are you joining the Fujifilm X system for this film-like shooting experience that you would only get with the SLR style or the rangefinder style cameras? Because as mentioned earlier, a lot of people want to shoot Fujifilm cameras just for this compact size and low weight, as well as the Fujifilm counters, and maybe they don't care that much about this film-like shooting experience. For me, this would be a no-go because I mostly shoot Fujifilm because of this shooting experience, but opinions differ. Unfortunately, I have to say, when you want to buy a Fujifilm camera, the rangefinder style options are currently kind of ruled out because of a price hike. Comparing equal rangefinder style models to the SLR style models, they're usually a couple of €100 more expensive. So even buying them secondhand doesn't really make any sense right now. For example, the XE4, which was released in 2021, back then it set you back around 900 euros. If you would buy the same camera secondhand today in a like new or excellent condition, you would pay around 1,400 euros. So 500 euros more expensive. I mean, if you want to spend that money, you can. I would personally not, even though I like these cameras very much. So it's pretty much between the SLR style cameras as well as the PASM dial cameras. If you like PASM dial cameras, a good option right now would be the older generation XS10, which you could buy right now in an excellent condition for around 800 euros. Other than that, I've heard great things about the slightly older but still very capable XH1, which you can buy in a like new condition for around 600 euros right now. Unfortunately for the PASM dial cameras, if you buy a new camera, you would pay more than 1,000 euros, because I think the cheapest option right now is the XS20, which would be around 1,200, 1,300 euros. But if you'd rather go with an SLR style camera and want to buy a new camera, not a used one, you can buy the X-T30 Mark II right now for around 900 euros. But there are also other good options. For example, the X-T3 that I talked about earlier, that you can buy for the same price, and an equally good deal, actually an incredible deal I think, the X-T2, which you can buy for as low as 600 euros in an excellent condition right now. Personally, I chose the SLR style of cameras with the X-T4, which I think I bought in 2021. It's just because I think it combines the videography and photography aspect the best with the flippy screen it has. Back then I bought this camera new, but again, in retrospect, I think it would have probably been a better option to buy a second-hand camera with the X-T3 or X-T2, which already was a great deal back then. But with all this camera talk, there's one very important thing I want to make clear. That is that lenses are more important than the camera. And I know it's talked about all the time, but it's true. Because my choice back then, when I first got into the Fujifilm X system, I thought I needed the best, which admittedly was the Fujifilm X-T4 at that time. But now they already have the X-T5 and the X-H2 and 2S, and I don't see myself upgrading in the near future. Because the best camera is the one that you can afford in conjunction with a good lens lineup. Because no matter how good the autofocus is, how big the battery is, or how high-res the viewfinder is, the most important thing is what you can do with your camera. And I found the only limiting factor to what you can do with your camera is what lenses you have. I think it's easy to fall into this trap of comparing all these cameras that are out there because they have so many features to look into. But that's just the gear acquisition syndrome talking in your head. Anyway, if you want to find out about an entry-level camera that Fujifilm will release within the year 2024, check out this video right here.